What is suicide? Well, according to the dictionary definition, suicide is an act of intentionally terminating one's own life, that is, taking one's own life. However, this definition does not do justice to the complexity of the concept and the numerous usages of terms across studies. These involve biological, genetic, and environmental risk factors. Suicide is said to be a final act of behavior that is probably the end result of interactions of several different factors. Now, Durkheim, a French philosopher, identifies 4 different types of suicide, which are egoistic, altruistic, anomic, and fatalistic suicide. What are these various types of suicide? Egoistic suicide, according to him, is when a man becomes socially isolated or feels that he has no place in the society, which ultimately destroys him. This is the suicide of self-centered person who lacks altruistic feelings and is usually cut off from the mainstream of the society. The second one happens to be altruistic suicide. This type of suicide usually occurs when individuals in the group are too close and intimate. This kind of suicide results from over-integration of the individuals into social group, for example, sati customs, etc. Third happens to be anomic suicide. This type of suicide is due to certain breakdown of social equilibrium, such as suicide after bankruptcy or after winning a lottery, etc. In other words, anomic suicide takes place in a situation which has cropped up suddenly. The fourth and the last one is fatalistic suicide. This type of suicide is due to over-regulation in the society. Under the over-regulation of the society, when a servant or a slave commits suicide, when a barren woman commits suicide, it is the example of a fatalistic suicide. What is philosophy of suicide? There's this famous line by the French novelist playwright Albert Camus, which goes like, "There's but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide." In ethics and other branches of philosophy, suicide actually possesses difficult questions answered differently by various different philosophers, which we would be looking at shortly. For philosophers, suicide raises a host of conceptual, moral, psychological questions like what makes a person's behavior suicidal? What motivates such a cruel behavior? Is suicide morally permissible or even morally required in any form? Is the behavior rational? And so on and so forth. The two main moral issues regarding this topic is, first, whether suicide is morally permissible, and if yes, if so, in what circumstances? And second, whether a person who knows that someone is contemplating or attempting suicide, does that person have an obligation to intervene? And if yes, how strong is that obligation? How far can that person go? With respect to the first issue, it is difficult to resist the conclusion that suicide is wrong in itself. To categorize suicide as murder of oneself is incorrect perhaps. Even if people who commit suicide deprive the community of some good, there is actually no general duty to provide good services to others. Theological objections to suicide are not persuasive, and suicides could be rational. For example, if one's scheme of values is to maximize the overall value of experience, then at some point, if in the future the negative value of its life outweighs the positive ones, then suicide would actually be considered rational. Philosophical stance on suicide can be divided into two broad groups. One happens to be religious philosophy, which almost universally condemns suicide, while the non-religious stance, the other one, tend to focus towards the toleration, with some seeing it as laudatory depending on the circumstance. There's this another confusing stance that utilitarianism offers. For example, Jeremy Bentham's hedonistic calculus, which if we happen to go by that, although suicide offers utility by ending personal suffering, the grief it causes others may outweigh its utility. The calculation cannot be determined at a philosophical level.
Voluntary euthanasia is a complex topic that involves personal choice, suffering, the value of life, and medical ethics. Personal choice. It believes that individuals should have the right to choose euthanasia to end their severe sufferings, respecting their autonomy. Reduce suffering. Voluntary euthanasia might be acceptable if it reduces the pain and enhances quality of life, especially in terminal cases. Quality of life. When life lacks meaning due to deterioration, euthanasia could be seen as a preserving dignity. Harm principle. Euthanasia could be permissible if a well-informed voluntary decision doesn't harm others. Doctor-patient relationship. Ethical conflicts arise as some emphasize honoring patient choices while others stress alleviating suffering and sustaining life. Autonomy and personal liberty are fundamental concepts that focus on self-governance, individual choice, and the right to make decisions about one's own life. These ideas have been discussed by philosophers from various traditions and times. Immanuel Kant and rational autonomy. Immanuel Kant stressed rational autonomy. He believed humans have inherent dignity and should be treated as ends in themselves, not as means to an end. According to Kant, individuals deserve respect for their autonomy, meaning they should be allowed to decide about their lives, including choices related to well-being and death. John Stuart Mill and liberty. John Stuart Mill, another important philosopher, introduced the harm principle, suggesting individuals should be free to act as long as they don't harm others. This principle could apply to voluntary euthanasia, allowing an individual to choose euthanasia if it doesn't harm others. Cases where suicide can be permissible. Assisted suicide and terminal illness. Individuals with terminal illness may opt for assisted suicide, seen as a morally justifiable to avoid undue suffering and retain control over death. End of life dignity. In places where it is legally permitted, those facing painful, incurable diseases might choose euthanasia or assisted suicide for preserving dignity and reducing suffering. War and self-sacrifice. In wartime, soldiers may self-sacrifice to safeguard comrades or achieve larger goals, with arguments that such acts can be morally justified. Historical examples. Throughout history, some societies practice voluntary suicide for honor, escaping capture, or spiritual reasons, with interpretations varying by culture. Existential suffering. Existential suffering marked by deep meaninglessness could justify suicide from an existential perspective. Irreversible personal circumstance. In cases of severe disability, trauma, or loss, some argue that ending one's life can be valid to escape ongoing agony. Individual well-being and flourishing. Suicide may be rationalized if it is believed that one's life won't positively contribute to personal well-being or others' welfare.
Most of the reasons for committing suicide, such as depression, emotional pain, or economic hardship, are temporary and can be eliminated by therapy or through making changes to some aspects of one's life. Suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. However, the argument against this is that while emotional pain may seem temporary to most people, in other cases it may be extremely difficult or even impossible to resolve, even through counseling or lifestyle change, depending on the severity of the affliction and the person's ability to cope with their pain. Points against suicide include absurdism for Camus, Suicide was the rejection of freedom. He thought that fleeing away from the absurdity of reality into illusions, religion, or death is not the way out. Instead of fleeing out the absurd meaninglessness of life, we should embrace life passionately. Then, coming to Christian-inspired philosophy, Christian theology almost universally condemns suicide as being a crime against God. G.K. Chesterton calls suicide the ultimate and absolute evil, the refusal to take an interest in existence. He argues that a person who kills himself, as far as he is concerned, destroys the entire world. In the 6th century AD, suicide became a secular crime and began to be viewed as sinful. In 1533, those who died by suicide while accused of a crime were denied a Christian burial. In 1562, all suicides were punished in this way.
Philosophers on suicide. Socrates. Plato recorded Socrates as saying that a man with the spirit of philosophy is ready to die, but must not take his own life. Socrates, according to Plato, had argued that according to the Greek laws of his days, it is unlawful to kill oneself. The story of how Socrates finally died. Socrates covertly accepted altruistic suicide. The death of Socrates resulted from his attempt to question the wisdom of the elite in the city. He further stated that, surrounded by friends and relatives, Socrates drank poison known as hemlock. This poison is a slow-acting agent that eventually works its way up from the feet until it reaches the heart. Aristotle's argument on suicide is said to have occurred in the midst of a discussion on the possibility of treating oneself unjustly. He said that self-killing does not indicate treating oneself unjustly as long as it is done voluntarily. This, according to him, is due to the fact that the harm done to oneself is mostly consensual. On the strength of this position, Aristotle concluded that suicide is wrong to the state or community. He then viewed suicide, the state, and the law. This was why he argued that as long as man is a part of the society, he is duty-bound to obey the laws of the society. Extended further, the law cannot be said to permit suicide since it is an act against the rule of life. The state has the full weight and right to enforce this right rule. The implication of this is that since the state or community depends on the economic and social contributions of the members, they have an obligation to contribute to the society. Plato discussed suicide in two major works. The first was in Phaedo. Here, the philosopher Socrates was said to have declared that suicide was always wrong, due to the fact that it represents our releasing ourselves, that is our souls, from a guard post, that is our bodies. The gods have placed us in a form of punishment. The second was in the Laws, where Plato asserted that suicide is disgraceful, hence the perpetrator should be buried in unmarked graves. The second part, that is the Laws, however, recognize some exceptions as outlined by Plato, and these are: when one's mind is morally corrupted and one's character cannot be salvaged.
Immanuel Kant held a strong and unequivocal stance against suicide. His ethical and philosophical framework centered on principles of rationality, morality, and the inherent worth of human beings. Kant's views on suicide are primarily derived from his deontological ethical theory and his emphasis on treating individuals as ends in themselves rather than as means to an end. Kant's perspective on suicide can be summarized as follows. Duty to preserve life. Kant believed that individuals have a moral duty to preserve their own lives, according to his categorical imperative of fundamental principles of ethics. One should act in a way that their actions could be universally willed as a moral law. Suicide, in Kant's view, involves treating oneself as a mere means to escape suffering or difficulties, rather than valuing one's rational nature and inherent dignity. Contradiction in will. Kant argued that suicide is contradictory to rational will that seeks to maintain and preserve one's existence. Taking one's own life contradicts the fundamental inclination to live and pursue one's moral duty in the world. Dignity and autonomy. Kant emphasized the importance of respecting human dignity and autonomy. He believed that individuals possess intrinsic worth and should be treated as rational beings capable of making moral choices. Suicide, in Kant's eyes, undermines this autonomy and disrespects the rational nature of humanity. Social and moral consequence. Kant was concerned about the broader consequence of suicide on society and moral principles. He believed that allowing suicide could weaken the moral fabric of society and diminish the respect for human life. In essence, Kant's philosophy leads him to firmly reject suicide as a moral choice. He sees suicide as a violation of duty to preserve one's own life and an affront to inherent worth and rational nature of human beings. Kant's perspective on suicide is deeply rooted in his broader ethical framework and his emphasis on universality of moral principles. David Hume held a more nuanced and pragmatic view on the subject of suicide compared to some of his contemporaries. Hume's thoughts on suicide are found in his essay On Suicide, which is a part of his collection of essays titled Essays, Moral, Political, and Literary. Hume's perspective on suicide can be summarized as follows. Compassion and empathy. Hume showed a compassionate understanding of emotional and psychological struggles that may lead an individual to consider suicide. He recognized that extreme suffering, pain, and mental distress might push someone to contemplate ending their own life. Natural inclinations. Hume believed that human beings have a natural instinct for self-preservation. He acknowledged that suicide contradicts this instinct, but he also recognized that circumstances and mental states could override this inclination in some cases. Consideration of consequences. Hume's approach to morality was consequentialist in nature. He suggested that morality of an action should be evaluated based on its overall effects on human happiness and well-being. In the case of suicide, he argued that the consequences for society and the individual's loved ones should be carefully considered, balancing individual freedom and societal welfare. Hume recognized the tension between an individual's autonomy and the potential harm that suicide could cause to society and the people around them. He encouraged a balanced perspective, taking into account the individual's suffering and potential repercussions of their actions. Practicality and reasoning. Hume urged for rational deliberation when contemplating suicide. He believed that individuals should carefully weigh the reasons for and against suicide, considering the potential effects on their own well-being and well-being of others. Hume's essay on suicide demonstrates his willingness to engage with the topic in a thoughtful and emphatic manner. While he did not outright condone or condemn suicide. He emphasized the importance of rational consideration, empathy, and an awareness of the broader consequences when discussing this complex and sensitive issue.
Some ancient Stoic philosophers who supported suicide. The general position of the Stoics is that once the means of living a rich and flourishing life are absent, suicide is justifiable. In this instance, the Stoics further argue that the nature of the man requires some natural advantages, for example, physical health. The absence of this will make man unhappy. The consequence is that anyone who discovers that such advantages are lacking in his life believes that ending such life would rather neither enhance nor diminish his or her moral value. Arguing against the position of Plato and Aristotle, the Stoics contend that it is not only the concerns related to one's obligations to others that justify suicide, but one's private good is also important. Epictetus was another Stoic philosopher who accepted suicide. He expressed his position that death is not wrong, neither is it evil. To him, if man discovers that the desire to maintain life diminishes drastically, any attempt to die voluntarily is no evil. Lucretius. Lucretius was a Stoic philosopher who believed that suicide should be permitted in suffering. He is said not to have innately subscribed to suicide as the right end. He, however, argued that if life calls for suicide, he would have no option or choice but to embrace it. He actually saw suicide as self-murder, but would rather prescribe it, howbeit reluctantly, as an inevitable evil that could serve as an antidote for escaping suffering. Religious views on suicide. For Buddhists, since the first precept is to refrain from the destruction of life, including oneself, suicide is seen as a negative act. If someone dies by suicide in anger, he may be reborn in a sorrowful realm due to negative final thoughts. Nevertheless, Buddhism does not condemn suicide without exception, but rather observe that the reasons for suicide are often negative. In Hinduism, suicide is spiritually unacceptable. Generally, taking your own life is considered a violation of the code of ahimsa, that is non-violence, and therefore equally sinful as murdering another. Some scriptures state that to die by suicide results in becoming a ghost or wandering earth until the time one would have otherwise died. The Mahabharata talks of suicide, stating those who perform the act can never attain regions of heaven that are blessed. In Jainism, suicide is regarded as the worst form of himsa, that is violence, and is not permitted. Ahimsa is the fundamental doctrine of Jainism, that is non-violence. According to the Jain text, when death is near, the vow of fasting to death is observed by properly thinning the body and the passions. It also mentions that this is not suicide, since the person observing it is devoid of all passions like attachment.
Further conclusion, as the foregoing discussion indicates, suicide has been and continues to be a rich field of philosophical investigation. Not only is suicide worthy of philosophical investigation in its own right, it is a source of insight for various different philosophical subdisciplines like moral psychology, ethical theory, social and political philosophy as well. It is an area where philosophical interests intersect with those of the empirical sciences. The collective efforts of philosophers and others continue to illuminate one of the most enigmatic